Good evening. I'm Arielle Cates. I'm the manager of programming and communications at the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. I'm so glad you're all here tonight, and I am very grateful to the New School for being our hosts this evening, and to Earth Celebrations, the New York City Community Garden Coalition, and the New School's Tishman Environment and Design Center for being our partners and co-sponsors. So just a little bit about GVSHP. GVSHP has been doing really crucial work since 1980 to advocate for cultural and architectural preservation in Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We're fighting daily to stop inappropriate developments, expand landmark protections, and protect our neighborhoods and their residents. We serve our members and friends through this work and through our programs, which highlight our neighborhood's unique histories, features, and movements. We're a nonprofit membership-based organization, so your involvement and support are crucial to our work. So I hope you'll check us out at gvshp.org and on all social media platforms. So if you could, this is the moment where I ask you to silence anything you have that might make noise. And thank you in advance for doing that. So I'm very glad to introduce tonight's panel. Anna Baptista is assistant professor in the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management program at the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy. She's also the Associate Director for the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School. Anna's work focuses on environmental and climate justice and works directly with impacted communities to advance resiliency plans, among many other things. Aziz Dehkan is Executive Director of the New York City Community Garden Coalition with a degree in biological sciences. Aziz has worked for organizations including the Humane Society, the New York City Coalition for the Homeless, the Fortune Society, Solitary Watch, United for Iran, the Peace Action Network, and the People's Climate Movement Rally in Washington, D.C. Felicia Young is a social action artist, theatrical pageant director, and the founder and executive director of Earth Celebrations, a nonprofit organization engaging communities to effect ecological and social change through the arts. Her social action art projects include a 15-year grassroots annual theatrical pageant, which led to the preservation of hundreds of community gardens in New York City and the engagement of community in Hudson River restoration efforts. Lynn Englum is Rebuild by Design's policy manager. With a decade of experience in environmental policy, sustainable development, community outreach, and program management, Lynn's work is in identifying and addressing policy barriers to resilience implementation and coordinating communities to better prepare for the impact of a changing climate. Lynn's writings have appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle, the Huffington Post, and more, and her degrees are in global environmental politics and public affairs and environmental management. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Lynn's gonna kick us off this evening with her. So each presenter will describe their work briefly, and then we're gonna have a conversation and then open it up for questions, right?
Yeah, great. Well, good evening, everybody. Give a little background about RBD, but first off is give a little general idea of where we're at in terms of the climate change movement and impacts. It's a slide I always like to show because it tells you a little bit of where we're going in terms of temperature rise and storm intensity, and especially urban population centers. We're seeing that a lot of people are moving into cities. By 2050, the global population, 75% of the global population will be in cities, and so cities are going to become the hubs of vulnerability, if you will, also the hubs of innovation as well, and a lot of them are on coastal environments. So New York is not the only one in that space. This past year we saw some of these similar scenes that we've seen around this area, but Houston got hit really hard, and San Juan as well got to experience some of the harshness of a changing climate that we're experiencing. And some of these visuals were something that we saw during Hurricane Sandy and experienced 5 years ago, and the unprecedented impact that happened with Hurricane Sandy. And in that space is kind of where Rebuild by Design was born out of, which is why I wanted to kind of remind folks of that space and the unprecedented impact that happened. Sandy was a wake-up call for the vulnerability that we had in the region, the physical and the social vulnerability that we experienced, and a lot of you probably experienced it yourself. But when thinking about disaster, whether it's Houston or San Juan, there's this big push to build, to get back on your feet and to build back. But Rebuild by Design and our work was about building forward for the future. How do we think about the next storm, and what is our infrastructure going to look like to prepare us for that changing future, as you saw, like the sea level rising, the temperature rise. And so Rebuild by Design was a competition, essentially taking Sandy money and repurposing it toward building back for the future. And specifically around two big pillars of the work was how do we look at the entire New York City region and think about what we want it to look like for the future. And so a group of 10 design teams came together and went through a collaborative research and design process, which is what Rebuild by Design essentially is. It's core pillars of what we do, which was around what happened during Hurricane Sandy, what were all the overlapping interdependencies and the vulnerabilities, and then understanding what were the hotbeds of the economic, physical, and social vulnerabilities, and where were they within the region in terms of where to focus projects. And so from that, a series of 10 projects came together and moved toward a design phase that was around this idea that collaborative design with community was a big part of it. How do we take the community lived experiences, add it into the process as we're designing for these projects? And what came out of it was 10 projects across the whole metropolitan region, from Connecticut to Staten Island to, of course, here in Manhattan. And specifically, 7 of them were funded. And they're all in the process of, it was about $1 billion that went toward these projects, and they're all in the process of being implemented. No ground has been broken yet. Unfortunately, that'll happen in a few years. But right now, the city is going through within New York and New Jersey and Connecticut are moving in the path of trying to get these projects built and thinking very forward-looking with the projects. And specifically, the one that I'll pull on for an example, because this would take this could take hours to go through all the projects because they're very detail-oriented. But the project that I think is probably most interesting to this community is the Big U project, which was around protecting the whole lower tip of Manhattan, kind of creating a flood barrier for the whole lower tip of Manhattan. And in this project, 2 compartments are in the process of being built. But I think the really interesting part of the Big U project and concept was what these projects around the region tried to do is let's look at the flood and the storm surge vulnerability, but then let's think about how do we create infrastructure that also solves for health issues, also solves for recreational issues, also improves transit options and biodiversity options. And so how can we use climate resilience as a space to think about the holistic picture, not just a storm barrier, something that's much more innovative and useful from a community perspective, from a holistic perspective. So we can talk a little bit more about this project going forward, but this, I think this is a great example, and all the projects had these kind of multi-benefit components too of what it wasn't just a seawall, it's a ball field and that sort of thing. And then in terms of the work we're doing now, we're in cities all over the globe, kind of taking this collaborative research and design phase in other places, but we are definitely very much couched in the Sandy region because that's kind of where we were born. So I'll stop it at that. Perfect. And on to the next.
You can ask Aziz to go next. Tell us about some of his work with Gardens Rising.
Hi, everybody. My name is Aziz Dehkan. I'm the executive director of the New York City Community Garden Coalition. We advocate for the 600 community gardens in the city. And I thought the best way to start would be to just give you a quick overview of what community gardens are and how they started. So in 1970, and this picture on the right, on the bottom right, is like my favorite. They look like they're guerrilla fighters in a different country. And by the way, they kind of were. So these are pictures from the Lower East Side. What happened here happened in the Bronx, happened in Brooklyn, and it was just a real change of taking land back and turning it into gardens. So as time went by, the 70s, I'm going to quick go through. Adam Purple's garden is on the far left side. Adam Purple did everything in this picture came from that particular site. And if you look at it, it also has the same vision that the Imagine Garden does up in Central Park. Adam Purple was quite a character in New York City, died recently. And this is where it gets really interesting. So our good friend Rudy Giuliani, as mayor, decided that these community gardens were vacant lots. And as you can see by some of those pictures, there's nothing vacant about these lots. So he started selling them off and creating, havoc throughout the city in trying to build affordable housing, or just at that point, actually, I take it back. It wasn't even affordable housing; it was just housing. We call it affordable housing now, but that's a whole different topic for a different day. But nothing has really changed from through the 90s. We still fight for land in this city, and we still try to keep community gardens vibrant and protected as much as possible. Bulldozing a working garden is an act of neighborhood violence. Yeah, it still is, by the way. And a few years ago, we lost 11 community gardens throughout the city. They wanted to take 34 away. We advocated and fought for just 11, and that's like a horrific victory. Basically, it's not what we wanted. We want to create 34 more gardens, not to see them get bulldozed and turned into glass houses. As you go into the late 90s, same thing. We're just keep fighting and watching 114 gardens getting sold off, but Public Land Trust and the New York Restoration Project came in and started to buy some properties and really did save quite a bit of land for the community gardens. But if you think about it, it really wasn't just those organizations. It was the people. It was the people working really, really hard at making sure that land stayed open and land stayed for the people. I always tell, and I'll tell you all, when they say that this is city property, it's not. This is the people's property. This is our land. And we should never, ever forget that if it's our land, and it is, we should have a say in what happens to it. So that's our fight with Rudy Giuliani. I mean, there's kind of a love-hate relationship with him because we love to hate him. I mean, that's about the only way to say it. In 2010, there was an agreement by Elliot Spitzer to protect about, 190, 200 community gardens. They went into Green Thumb. If you look at the Green Thumb license that we all sign as community gardeners, it's not really, the first thing it says is this is not a lease. And because it's not a lease, you don't have certain rights to your ownership of your land, basically. So they can always take this away from you. It's rare, but it happens. And again, 11 community gardens, 4 of them up in East Harlem are gone, and it's a shame. The only good thing about that is that right next to those community gardens was a baseball field that Donald Trump put together, so that's gone too. So goodbye. Sadly. So we have an agreement through the mayor's office. We got involved in the People's Climate March in 2014, and the coalition was marching. This is our big banner. This is our umbrella. And as we move forward, we still see, like in 2013, this is a picture of a community garden in Coney Island. And it was right on the boardwalk. When Hurricane Irene hit, that garden got inundated with sand. And those gardeners literally, grain by grain, took that sand out. They redeveloped that garden. Hurricane Sandy came, did the same damn thing to the garden. They rebuilt it, and then they bulldozed the damn thing into the ground. And I'm sorry to use the word damn, but it really gets me angry to see this picture. I mean, this was a 16-year-old community garden, and a 16-year-old community garden in a neighborhood that had just about every ethnicity you could imagine. And they all didn't get along in that community, but they got along in this community garden. And that's the difference. So I'm talking fast because I want to kind of blow through these. But so Gardens Rising is a project. How long do I have? Like 2 minutes? Yeah. So New York City Community Garden Coalition does not do projects, basically, but we were offered this project to take community gardens. There's 47 community gardens on the Lower East Side. And so we were offered this project to take the 47 community gardens and use them as a way to keep water out of the combined sewer outflows. And it's a part of what Lynn was talking about with Hurricane Sandy money. And it's a $2 million project. We did, the first part was this feasibility study, which we designed, was our landscape architects on this project. And we, as a group, won an award for this feasibility study, which blows my mind, because really, we didn't know what we were doing. We were just figuring this stuff out, and it's a great project. The best part of this project is it's all about community engagement. We don't do anything in this project without consulting the gardeners. And actually on Wednesday, we're having a community garden meeting to talk about this next phase, which is building green infrastructure. And the green infrastructure is really simple. It's rain barrels, it's bioswales, it's creating rain gardens. You put more trees into the gardens, they capture water before it hits the ground. The fact is, and I think Lynn has said this also, that the next Hurricane Sandy, we can't stop all that water. But this last storm that we had that had 3 or 4 inches and all the subways look like waterfalls, we can help stop that. And anything that that the New York City Community Garden Coalition can do to make community gardens more vibrant and have more value to the city, instead of having them look at it, and a lot of them are still mapped as vacant properties, vacant land. Anything we can do to help that, and anything we can do to make green infrastructure in this city more vibrant and make the city sustainable and resilient, that's what we're trying to do.
Now we'll have Felicia Young talking about Earth Celebration.
Hi. I'm going to start by telling you a bit about a journey. So back in 1991, I was living on the Lower East Side, saw the incredible community gardens. Adam Purple's garden had been destroyed, and wanted to figure out a way to organize the community. This was all pre-internet. How can we save these community gardens throughout the neighborhood? So my approach as an artist was applying the arts on a community level to bring people together, to make them more aware of what was actually happening, engage both community centers, schools, artists, gardeners, community people. I mean, literally thousands of people in the neighborhood were part of this pageant that we staged for 15 years throughout the Lower East Side, which resulted in the end in hundreds of gardens getting transferred to parks. The Lower East Side Garden Preservation Coalition was started, as well as the coalition that became what Aziz now directs was initiated out of that project. I then took that same model and applied it to engaging people on river restoration efforts that were underway in around 2008. And for 4 years, we staged this pageant that engaged people in river restoration efforts, from buffering erosion and planting oysters in the river to organically cleanse the river, recycling programs and boating programs. And there were so many different things happening along the waterfront. And I had always grown up with this river that was never accessible and polluted throughout my childhood, and was so happy to find a way to really engage people creatively in that. I took that same method briefly, that was a picture in India to restore a polluted river. And then you have here Hurricane Sandy, and how all of a sudden the gardens that we had preserved were now providing all these climate resiliency solutions. So 25 years fast forward, I see that the gardens we've preserved, we're now providing solutions, as Aziz mentioned, everything from bioswales and water harvesting ponds and pollinator gardens. And I was so inspired to see the evolution that had we not saved the gardens, there would be no climate resiliency, and how this played between what was happening locally to the impacts globally. Like if you think about the Paris Climate Agreement and how you're going to reach those goals, and how the community gardens are really a boon to that initiative. So I've now designed a another community creative engagement procession and project. I've been working on it for a year and a half with over 50 community partners from the gardeners and waterfront organizations, schools, community centers. There are over 50 partners also in this project. We've been running 3 months of workshops. That's climate consequences, renewable energy, water harvesting, spirit, Gaia and the climate, resiliency solutions, puppets of bioswales, puppets of climate solutions, renewable energy, pollution monsters. So this is all green roof. We're celebrating the green roof at the Earth School. The kids are all making green roof headdresses. So this is all leading up to May 12th, which is the Ecological City Pageant, which will be a 6-hour procession going to 20 sites, each site celebrating an actual solution that is being implemented and designed. It includes 12 gardens, the green roof, bee farms, community solar projects, and 5 sites along the waterfront, each highlighting different resiliency initiatives, including the Big U berm, coastal resiliency, gray water recycling, waterfront access, and water cleansing ceremonies. So that's just a little bit in brief about how I have approached for the past, I've been working on this work for 30 years, applying the arts as a way of really building that emotional connection, that empathy, because if you can think about all of these sort of data, I mean, how do you get people excited about disaster preparedness? It's hard. But if you can engage them creatively on these issues, taking this information, all these solutions that are happening around, people walk up and down the street, they don't even realize, since a lot of this is in the design phase, that these are not solutions we need to imagine. These are solutions that are actually happening all around us. And I guess it's basically connecting a lot of the work that's underway between the gardens, between the waterfront, and between these neighborhood solutions. And I really believe through joyous and creative affirmation that you create not just political change and ecological, social change, but it's that cultural shift that begins to happen. So we're looking forward to it.
Well, thank you. Each of our panels is so interesting. You can see all the interconnections and relationships between the different organizations. So we have plenty of time. I'm gonna kick it off by asking some questions of our panelists so they can tell us a little bit more in depth about their work, and then we're gonna leave plenty of time so that all of you can ask questions as well. So I'm gonna start out by asking Aziz if you could tell us a little bit more about how you connect gardeners to this idea of climate resiliency. Is it like a natural thing that people just get and fall right into? And obviously community gardens have a role to play in resiliency, but what have you seen as some of the challenges and opportunities of connecting those two things?
It's really easy to put together community gardeners and climate change. I mean, if you've looked at this last few springs that we've had, it was warm in the middle of the winter, it gets cold, it's cold now, trees are budding out when it's snowing. I mean, it's that the people who work the land, whether it's in community gardens or on larger farms, they see the differences that are happening out there. So it's really easy to engage them because it's their, in some cases it's their livelihood, but with community gardeners, especially those who grow food, it's a big part of what they do. So yeah, we see it all the time, and I think it's easy to bring them in and make them understand. Our project, Gardens Rising, is a community engagement project, and so it's really easy to make them see, where does this water go? How do you protect the streets, and then by the byproduct of that is how do you protect the gardens? And so, when Hurricane Sandy hit, the gardens were like the refuge for a lot of people. They were absorbing a lot of water, and I think that's part of how this project came about for us anyway, was when the water receded, it receded quicker in community gardens because it's like a sponge. Right. So it's really easy to engage people in that regard.
Great. I'm going to turn it over to you, Lynn. And sounds like Rebuild by Design has sort of flourished since Sandy and expanded their work. And sometimes right after the storm or right after the big event, it's the easiest time for people to make those connections and see the urgency of the issue. But you guys have been doing this now for a while, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about how do you sustain the work beyond the big hurricane or the big natural disaster? And what are some of the biggest lessons? I mean, I'm sure Rebuild by Design had a lot of lessons that they learned about how to prepare communities, particularly in this case in Lower Manhattan. What were some of the lessons that you learned going through the Rebuild by Design process about how you maintain the urgency of the issues present and keep the issues moving forward?
Well, yeah, I mean, the sense of urgency aspect is a question that I think we ask ourselves a lot. But in terms of, you think about the impacts of Hurricane Sandy, and the fact that, when you think about the impacts of Hurricane Sandy and the fact is, people rebuild and then the urgency dies down. I think the interesting thing about Hurricane Sandy was so impactful that you still see the remnants of it. Like, tell that to the people that depend on the L train that's about ready to be shut down next year, which is a direct result of the salt water that came in from Sandy. And so there's still impacts that are being felt. And so in some degrees, that urgency is still there. But the Rebuild by Design competition happened almost a year after Sandy hit. And so so there was a continual drumbeat in a lot of ways. And as part of that process that we went through, it was continually re-engaging the community. And in some ways it was actually exhaustion. They were like almost overstimulated with so many things going on. And in some ways there's that balance in disaster. So, but I think there's been a continual opportunity for communities to engage in the projects, and that's been part of the process throughout these projects as they've been implemented. And so encouraging community groups to get people out to give feedback as the projects change. And these are in their backyards, and people really care about it because it's going to impact their community. So I think when it impacts your community and your backyard, people are much more interested in listening and will be part of it. So we've seen that sense of urgency more so than maybe you might think in terms of people's sustained inclusion and being part of the process. In terms of your kind of second question and with regard to some of the lessons learned from the design competition, and it was really around this kind of component of this multi-benefit approach to infrastructure, and that as we go forward with infrastructure development, that this needs to be at the forefront of how we operate. This needs to be how we are thinking about things. How do we both create infrastructure and build community at the same time? And what does that look like? And of course, there's there's the basic kind of how do you prepare yourself personally on a personal basis that I think we didn't directly deal with for our competition, but that becomes something that I think everybody should be thinking about. How do you prepare yourself for the next storm personally and in your community and in your building and that sort of thing? So, because everything was kind of caught off guard. We were caught off guard, right, in this regard. So.
Felicia, we loved seeing those slides with the beautiful pageantry. So I think it would be great to hear a little bit more from you about how you engage the larger public in climate resiliency through the arts, and maybe if you want to give some specific examples of some of the work that's most inspired you as you've been doing this for so many years in the communities.
Right. Well, when I started this, I didn't really have a model. I had done some pageants. I'm half Indian. I'd gone to India and documented these very large-scale dramas. So I had done somewhat of that model, and I just responded to a problem in my neighborhood by saying, oh, okay, we'll organize a procession. And especially at that time before the internet, if you were having a struggle like this within the neighborhood, this was the only way to get the word out. I mean, and I figured by going garden to garden to garden, you would connect one to the other. You would essentially, it was a form of what I call cultural organizing, where you are forming a coalition, but the process by which you form the coalition is creative and artistic. It's through the building of this project that may take 6 months or 9 months or a year. You're building diverse sector partnerships. So part of it is partnership building. You think in the end you've got 50 organizations from schools, community centers, religious organizations, garden groups, activist groups, environmental groups, so many different sectors that may not communicate with each other on a daily basis come together. Why do they come together? It's because it's fun. I mean, it's fun, it's creative, it's educational. The schools, everybody sees a different thing in it, and that's why they want to be part of it. So when you talk about community engagement, I feel that, you know, the creative form is so important. And having people, so through that procession to save the gardens, I mean, we did it the first year. I had no idea I'd be doing it for the next 15 years of my life. And we kept doing it and doing it. And then all of a sudden, Giuliani, this back in 1996, I read an article saying he's attacking all the gardens. And I literally called information, got the contacts of gardeners in Harlem, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Upper West Side. And that's how that New York City Garden Coalition got formed, was just as a response. But all of that energy grew out of what was essentially a creative project that built a coalition locally on the Lower East Side, eventually citywide, that continues now with Aziz. So, and then you had this, you know, Hurricane Sandy hit, and how all these resiliency solutions were made apparent. So that's where, you know, I had clearly seen through the garden processions for 15 years, and really only, when I had done this garden procession for 15 years, and in 2002, which was towards the end, after 13 years, hundreds of gardens were transferred to parks, so they were at least temporarily protected. And that's when I sort of recognized, and I felt like the model had worked. What nobody thought was possible, that a group of community people from basically a lot of low-income areas could ever get together and fight off the biggest real estate interests in New York. I mean, it was not something possible, but I know that that happened, and largely through this creative engagement process. Between that and our coalition efforts, it's the combination of that method that worked. And then I said, okay, we did it. How can we apply this method to other issues? So then I took it to the Hudson River and engaging people on river restoration efforts there for 4 years. Then I took it for 2 years to India to restore a polluted river there, and got a whole project launch and the city establishing a trust for the cleaning of the river. So I have seen how this creative engagement works, how it leads to policy change. So I'm certainly a believer. I think many of the people in the community are. And when I saw now that after Sandy, the gardens absorbed the floodwaters, they had received this $2 million grant putting in green infrastructure, and all these incredible solutions were underway. But they weren't alone. There are community solar projects that are happening, and bee farms, and sustainable agriculture, and green roofs, you know, the whole idea of like the urban agrihood. All these sustainability solutions exist. And then how that connects to what's also happening on the waterfront. So when I saw that, it just spoke to me, and I figured, well, now is time. Come back 25 years later, and we've designed this procession for climate solutions on May 12th, which basically brings together, I think, the work that everybody's spoken about here, you know, through this cultural engagement. So each of the 20 sites is going to highlight these solutions that are underway through performance, dance, music, theater, poetry, and incredible visual work that's been worked on for the past 3-4 months. Yeah.
Thank you. Some great great lessons there. And I wanted to turn a little bit to, you know, each of you are doing work at various scales and in different ways in Lower Manhattan. So I wanted to hear a little bit from each of you about what you think is the work that still remains to be done. You know, what are some of the challenges and climate resiliency gaps in Lower Manhattan that need to be filled? And any recommendations that you want to sort of bring forth that either your organizations are working on actively to advocate or advance, or things you want to encourage people to think about in terms of still there's so much more work to be done. And it may be even beyond the scope of your own individual organizations, but that you see that there's still a lot that still remains on the horizon to accomplish. Maybe we'll start with Aziz there on the end. Or any of you can start.
You want to start? I'll start. That's a loaded question. It really is. There's a lot in there. I've always been a believer in Tip O'Neill's attitude that everything is local, all politics is local. I think as we get deeper and deeper into where we are, not necessarily in the age of Trump, but just where we are as a society, I really see it almost as block by block now. And the Gardens Rising has really taught me that. I've been doing community organizing really about 50 years. I closed my high school down when I was 15 years old, so with a group of other kids, but still, it's been a long process. And I think as we move this forward, as we start to look at how to engage people, it is really block by block. And it's easier when it's community gardens, because community gardens are literally block by block. And especially on the Lower East Side, you have such a huge amount of gardens in a small area. So it really does inspire you to engage people, and people want to be engaged, I think. And this is a time when we all have to stand up and do something that feels good and that shows results. And again, I think part of what makes community garden so great in the community gardens is that you see those results. It's we're in spring, and yesterday we had Earth Day and we had Spring Awakening, and there's a reason why we call it that. I mean, everything is blooming, everything's coming back to life. So I think what we need to do is just to continue to move this model forward. I think what we've all been doing in different areas has been really important to make people more aware of Mother Earth and just, our little plots of land, and are just, again, I'll just go back to it, literally block by block, to be able to engage each other, to encourage each other, to resist and persist in the climate changes that we're seeing. And I think that's how we can make things happen. And it's the big U, it's the arts, it's all of us working together. It's all of us in this room and all of the people that working together to affect change.
Well, on that note, I think it's really important, the idea of affirming what's happening locally within the city, like Aziz was saying, block by block, but that visceral direct connection to nature within the city, to our river, to our garden on the block, to build that from both children and adults. Because if we don't have that connection, if we don't have that emotional connection to what we're ready to lose, then it's hard to take action. And that's why I feel the arts or the engagement plays, but it's so important to make that connection. Then once people have that connection to what's their local river or what's their local garden that's on their block, to its importance with filtering air or collecting water and filtering pollution runoff, all these ideas are not abstract anymore. They directly connect to where these people live on their daily basis, and then they understand their local ecosystem. And then at the same time, especially today, they understand the role and the contribution that these local efforts are playing in achieving and with global climate challenges. So every effort locally now, and I think we're so much more aware of that now than we were years ago, how all our efforts locally contribute globally. And, at the same time, you think like Mayor de Blasio may say, New York City is upholding the Paris Climate Agreement. We have goals that need to be met in terms of lowering, temperature and carbon. It makes no sense. They can say that and then at the same time, they will destroy gardens. It makes no sense where they say we're going to put $10 million to create a project to meet a sustainability goal when they won't what costs nothing to protect what we already have. And so if we talk about New York City upholding the Paris Climate Agreement and being a leader globally on this initiative, then we need to recognize what are these grassroots initiatives, not initiatives created at the top level by institutions and well-funded organizations, but people and volunteer efforts by what are mostly low-income communities that are there leading the way, providing solutions. And we need to protect that, and we need to fund it and not destroy it. So.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I would echo everything that these two have just said, and I will say, just to piggyback in terms of local to global, one of the amazing things about being New Yorkers and living in the city is that the world also looks at what we do here for inspiration. That's the case with the Rebuild by Design projects, but it's also the case with whether it's a series of community gardens or kind of pushing the envelope with what's going on here, is that what happens here inspires globally. And I get lots of questions when I'm in other cities of what is New York doing? What are they doing? What should we be inspired from? What should we be taking from New York City? And so I think that's really exciting in terms of the local to global component of New York City. But when it comes to the question, what do we need to continue to do? I guess I'll take a look at it from a perspective of just looking at these particular projects, the Big U project and other projects. And whenever you're dealing with these kind of real innovative, pushing the envelope type of projects, oftentimes there's a whole lot of opportunities between the time that they're developed or conceived and then when they're actually put in the ground to value engineer all the good stuff out of it. So it's communities continuing to push on keeping those values in and the things that they asked for and the things that they wanted that were part of the competition in the first place when communities really wanted certain aspects of it, and they have continued to come out, but there's a continual drumbeat that needs to happen to demand those resilience aspects continue to stay in those projects. And I think that's been a big thing for us in terms of continuing that aspect.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to open it up for questions to the audience. And I think we have time for one more. And it's my prerogative as moderator, since you're at the New School, and I help run a center called the Tishman Environment and Design Center. And our mission is really focused on climate and environmental justice, which really looks at, how are the most vulnerable people, the people least responsible for climate change and the most impacted on the front lines. What are the implications for them, and what are the solutions coming from those communities? Now, you all are working in a part of New York City that has plenty of communities of color and low-income communities. So I wanted to ask you how you factor in this idea of social justice and environmental and climate justice into the work that you all do on a daily basis with your organizations now. And anyone can take that question.
Well, these are vulnerable communities, and it's true. When Sandy hit, they all say who was, most impacted, and it was the people living in the NYCHA housing, which was closest to the waterfront, and their buildings, lost power, and many of those people, remained impacted for months and months. And what we're trying to do, we engage the community, so of course. The community is a diverse community, and they are a critical part of our efforts and our projects. Between the diversity of people who are the community gardeners, the diversity of organizations that represent these communities who are involved. And for example, like with the Ecological City Project, each of the sites, as I said, is highlighting a different aspect of these resiliency initiatives within the neighborhood. So you have LES Ready that's been doing all this emergency preparedness work and goals that kind of got the mandate from the city to bring together the Eastside Coastal Resiliency Project. So they're compiling data, very sort of dry work based on the community that was most impacted in these NYCHA housing buildings along the waterfront. So our engagement with that is I put a theater director who's now working with some of the NYCHA residents through LES Ready and Goals. They're integrating some of the data and initiatives that is basically a deliverable to the city. So they were planning to deliver like a stack of, I don't know, paper with lots of data and survey materials. So now we have a performance that's being created as one of the sites, which will be under the Williamsburg Bridge. And the residents themselves are helping write this performance with one of the theater directors. So that's just like one particular project. Then you think, not only is there the engagement of that community in telling their story and reinterpreting this data about the impact of Sandy and these climate resiliency solutions, but even the documentation of it can now be presented in city planning processes. I call it creative testimony. So along with that data pack, you could have a little video clip, you could have live performance excerpts that could be presented at a city council hearing meeting. So it's just will be another form of communication actually, even in the city planning process and engagement of this vulnerable community. So.
Yeah, I would just say I think it's really important when it comes to vulnerable to communities to put our money there. In terms of prioritization of budgets for vulnerable communities. One of the things about the Rebel by Design competition is that part of the process of evaluation of the projects and how the money was allocated was looking at the low to moderate income index, and the projects that hit that hit that harder than other ones were prioritized in terms of funds. And so the first compartment of the Big U is the East Side Coastal Resilience Project. It serves one of the largest public housing stock in Manhattan, and that's very purposeful in terms of making sure that the budget and the prioritization of that compartment is protecting that community. So I think that's an important aspect of this.
So I don't know, you can't separate social justice from environmental justice. You can't separate environmental justice from social justice. It doesn't work that way. And I think the people in distressed neighborhoods suffer obviously the most in when these events happen, but they suffer the most no matter what happens. And I think we have to remember that. I mean, it's not just about, we're talking about climate change and resiliency, but it's also about resiliency of communities. It's about resiliency of being just with people who have not been treated right. And so with all due respect to putting money in, money's not enough. Money isn't enough. You have to put your heart and your soul into this. And going back to Mayor de Blasio, I mean, our project, there's not one city dollar, not one city cent coming to our project. Not one. So what does that tell you about how the city works? And in the city, in the plan NYC that came out under Bloomberg, the two words that should have been spoken, community gardens, wasn't even in it. So this goes way further than distressed neighborhoods. This goes way further than underserved communities. This is social environmental justice at its core. And if we don't get on the ground and do something about it, it doesn't matter how much money you put in. It doesn't matter, again, with the due respect for the Big U, it doesn't matter how much we put into the Big U. If we don't actually serve the people and get to the people on a one-to-one basis, it doesn't happen. I'll finish with just my favorite story about community gardens. When we were in a meeting a few years ago, when HBD was taking gardens, there was a man at the table, and he said, I've lived in my apartment for over 25 years. I'm pretty sure that the person across the hall has lived there that long. I don't know who he is. He said, but I know everybody in my community gardens. And we don't call them just gardens. We call them community gardens for a reason. We call them community gardens because they're the neighborhood. They're the gathering spot for people where we get to know who we are. And it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. It doesn't matter how rich or poor you are. It's about working together. And so social environmental justice, that's how we coalesce around each other and how we work to keep distressed neighborhoods from being more distressed than they already are.
Yeah, and Aziz, I just want to say to that point that a lot of that these community gardens were created in the 70s out of rubble-strewn vacant lots and city neglect. And it was, they removed firehouses from these areas instead of an apartment burning, entire buildings and blocks burned down. It was sort of an effort of what they call planned shrinkage, where they, an effort of displacement, almost planned displacement. And the community themselves, these were low-income people who got together with their own energy, sweat, and vision to clear out the trash, to make a better environment for themselves, not because the city was providing services. So they provided, over those years, millions of dollars of social services free of cost to rebuild an entire community and make it what it is today. And that's the horrible thing in all of this, is that when you look at what people who have the least to give monetarily give and create to this city, and then to see how the city, even though they now have these goals to meet, and here on a silver platter, they have all these solutions being given to them by these low-income people, that they haven't come to the table to, I think in a really strong way to say, yes, this sustainability model exists. We thank the community for creating it, and we're going to amplify it and protect it.
Sweat equity.
All right, well, I'm going to take questions from the audience, and I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions and then together, and then we'll have the panelists answer the questions rather than going one question at a time, okay? So raise your hands if you have questions, and I think we're going to get the microphone out to you. Yeah? We have 1, 2, is there any other out there? Okay, we'll take those 2 first.
You guys use the word urgency a lot in all your each and every one of you, and urgency is something in the city. The most urgent thing, I think, is affordable housing, with so many people homeless, families homeless. And my question to you guys, the garden guys, the gardens, I've been passing gardens, there are people there. But for 7 months, there weren't. It's like a seasonal thing. My question to you guys is, can we take some of those plots, put up affordable housing, and have a roof garden with an elevator, much like Highland, the Highliner has a garden on it, where the garden's up high, has nice views, and has a nice, the same space as the footprint, but we have housing at the same time that's for 12 months a year. That's my question.
I'll give that one to you. What was the other? Somebody else here?
Thank you.
Hi, good evening. Yeah, my question is, first of all, I want to thank everybody on the panel and thank everybody for their terrific work on resiliency. But I just want to make sure that Rebuild by Design, I think you're not working on the big U anymore, right? I just want to verify that. Yeah, no. And so when you show that picture, people get an impression that Lower Manhattan has been fixed. It is resolved. There's a dry line there, and that the big U is complete. It is not. As former chair of Manhattan Community Board 1 during Superstorm Sandy, clawing back our neighborhood where only the 2 people in Manhattan drowned in our 1.5 square mile, one in Tribeca and one south of the New York Stock Exchange on Broad Street. And we had 7 feet of water at the South Street Seaport. Can you please, only in your drawing, show the 2.4 miles that have been funded, up on the east side, coastal resiliency, the 0.82 by 2 bridges, the city, we were never funded any of that for Lower Manhattan. We fought and advocated for years for $100 million, $8 million for FIDI. Battery Park City went ahead, and they're planning their own. The poor folks north of Chambers Street, all the way up along the Hudson River, are exposed, and the other folks north of 23rd Street. It is not the big U. please do not show that beautiful picture that I've seen in Europe and Frankfurt. I see tonight. It is a misnomer, and it makes our job harder to advocate for resiliency. So I just want to make sure that that the problem, it has not been resolved. We appreciate your work. It has not been resolved, and every single day we are fighting to rebuild our neighborhood. And also, I'm a member of the Storm Surge Barrier Working Group, and we just published an article, The Social Justice Case for a Metropolitan New York, New Jersey Regional Storm Surge Barrier, that was published in the April division of the New York Law Journal. So we have information on that strategy as well. Thank you.
So we have 2 questions, then we're going to get there's one more question here, but maybe we'll start answering these first 2, and then I'll go to the third one.
This is more of a information. CUNY published a study that they had done there, that there are 65 million solar miles, rooftops in New York City. So I'm just wondering, and then there's also a lot of documents coming out about building gardens, food gardens, so that people don't have to continue eating processed food. So I'm just wondering, is there a thought about coordinating with these different situations?
All right, so we've got a question on affordable housing versus gardens. The rebuild by design, sort of the image versus what's actually been built. And then how do we pull together some of the initiatives together with solar and food sheds and other ideas? So any of you are welcome to take the questions in any order you want.
I'd like to talk about the affordable housing question. The affordable housing has been used as a wedge against community gardens since forever. And if you look at the Housing Preservation Department, which owns a lot of city land, which owns all the city land basically, though I'll reiterate, it's our land, nevertheless, they continue to look at community gardens as affordable housing. And we can go into a long, long discussion about what really affordable housing is. And no, sir, let me finish. Wait. So I'm going to get to your rooftops in a second. So to take away community gardens to put in affordable housing is not the way to make the city resilient and sustainable. And you can, I'm not saying you did. I'm going to get to that in a second. Rooftops have very little accessibility. And how do you have a privately owned building and allow people, the public, to get up to the rooftop? And that doesn't work. Yeah, but the High Line's not an apartment building, sir. The High Line is an old railroad track that they rehabilitated. There's a huge difference between that. And let me make another point. In the Community Garden, New York City Community Garden Coalition, our membership, I'm going to tell you about 85% of our membership wants affordable housing. But to take it from community gardens and to build on community gardens is wrong. It's not just wrong. We just talked about social and environmental justice. It's a travesty against all of that. If you ask HPD right now, how many buildings do they have that they could rehab in this city to make affordable housing? They won't tell you. And why won't they tell you? They won't tell you because it costs developers way more money to take a rehabbed building and make it affordable housing. And let's not kid ourselves. What is affordable housing in this city? I'd like to know, because the affordable housing issue in this city is a ruse. And it's just a giveaway to developers. They're selling properties for $1 to each developer. They're taking community gardens from us and selling them to developers. There's nothing even remotely sane about doing this. We're here talking about climate change, and to take a community garden and build housing on it, it's not right. I don't even know how many times I can say that. And it's not just that it's not right, it's that we have lots of properties in this city that you can build truly affordable housing. Truly affordable housing, but don't take it away from open space. Open space, listen, I grew up on 72nd Street and West End Avenue in the 1950s and 60s, and I love what you said. One of you said, we always were told, don't ever swim in the East River. Don't ever swim in the East River. But we were swimming in the Hudson River with rats coming out of the sewer pipes. Oh yeah, that was great. So I know I'm drifting here, but the point is that in order to make this city livable, and this mayor ran on a tale of two cities, you can't go and build rooftops and in lieu of community gardens. It don't work. And I'm sorry to tell you that, but those community gardens are only closed for a few months because of the winter season. They're open now. They're vibrant. They'll stay vibrant right through November. And the way climate change is changing, they'll probably be open and open through January and February in the next couple of years.
Yeah, and anyway, most of the housing that they put in on these sites, even when we were fighting it on the Lower East Side, even when they said it was affordable or 80-20 housing, it was capped 10 years after 10 years. Many of those sites that were labeled 80-20 went fully market rate.
These are giveaways to
So
developers.
even when they say 80-20 housing, we've already lived through that history. 10-year cap usually on that, and then it goes fully market
And
rate.
let me go positive with you for a second too. And I'm not trying to point you out. I'm all for any new building that they build, put a rooftop garden on the top. Take all your old buildings and put rooftop gardens. But mind you, that you can't take an old building and put a rooftop garden on because of the weight restrictions.
Yeah,
it's a structural issue.
That's why I say build something
Yeah, build something new, but don't do it on community garden land.
All right, so we're gonna turn to another
sorry.
question. That's okay. No, an important.
It just sticks in my craw.
It's an important issue, and especially in a city with so many demands on land and the issues of gentrification and displacement present. It's very important that we have these debates and discuss them openly. So, and I want to turn maybe, I don't know, Lynn, if you want to address the RBD and the challenges of the vision versus the reality.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so I had 5 minutes to give a little brief about Real by Design, and if there's a little bit more time, we can get into some of the nuances of it. But so Real by Design, the competition ended, and then the projects were handed off to the grantees, which are the city government. So in the case of the Big U, for example, it's the city of New York. In the case of New Jersey, it's the state of New Jersey. And so while we stepped away from them from purposes of implementation, we were mostly there to help kind of keep track of the projects, keep the community connected to the projects, and also connect the projects to each other, and to try to figure out how we can add value in that space. In terms of where we are now with the projects, when it comes to kind of seeing these projects in other places and in exhibits around the globe, part of what we're doing now is taking the process to other places, and so these projects are serving as inspiration. And so, for example, the Bay Area Challenge that launched last year is a direct result of the inspiration from the concepts that came out of Rebuild by Design. As if I had more time to be more clear of what it looks like now, what it actually looks like, the compartments, because there's 2 compartments that are going to be built that are funded. The renderings are changing regularly, and the community is part of that process of what it looks like now. But I think in terms of the exhibits that you might be referring to, the one in Frankfurt, and they've been around the world in terms of those exhibits, in the description, we don't make reference to the fact that things are fixed by any means. That these are very much concepts of what a future of New York could look like. And I'm sorry that it seems like you've gotten some feedback that things are fixed, and that's just not the case, of course.
Top people say at the UN conference,
Yeah.
the problem's solved.
Yeah.
I'm like, what? It is not solved in Lower Manhattan, not south of the bridge. So it's at 0.82 miles.
Right.
And it's 0.4, and the rest of the 10 miles has not, is a battery park city, authority did not want to wait, so they took it upon themselves, and they're in a phase 2 of the development. And New York Rising, which I was the co-chair for Southern Manhattan, and funded, the city to subcontract out to do the studies.
Sure.
And in the last, we don't even have short-term things in place for 2018. Maybe in 2019, we're going to get a tighter dam for the South Street Seaboard and Kevlar
haven't read, hopefully, what you use in the art to fill in the blanks instead of emergency or a 5-year implementation plan. So we are nowhere near to that beautifully do. So if you can just say concept across there or show, the
Well,
small version where it has gone through the.
Right. One of the reasons we call it the Big U is because that was the name of the concept initially, and it's not called that now. It's East Side Coastal Resilience Project. It's Lower Manhattan. Exactly. They have different names now, right? And so which is, yes, that's kind of insider baseball to distinguish them, of course. But in terms of these projects, and the reason that we continue to use those renderings is for inspiration, essentially, and it has inspired places around the world, and which is really exciting. And it's like I said, it's encouraged the Bay Area to do something that's like this, and so I think that's a reason why we continue to do it.
Anyone want to speak to the last question, which I'm gonna try to reiterate around the mixing and matching of different kinds of resiliency efforts, solar with flood, with green infrastructure projects, with other types of resiliency projects.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly what I saw with, and what I'm bringing together with the Ecological City Project, is that there were all these diverse solutions going on. So one of the sites that we're celebrating has been proposed for a community solar project. There are many, there is no community solar in Manhattan yet, and this is one of the first sites that's already in the design phase. And the whole idea, like you were saying, of urban agri-hoods and farming, on the Lower East Side, I mean, it's done in small spaces, or the Earth School Green Roof and different community gardens. Out in Brooklyn, you have larger spaces, and you do have these kind of urban farms that exist. So I think a lot of what we're trying to do through Ecological City is bring these projects and these solutions together so people can see how they sort of form this new model, this new ecosystem for sustainability within the city. And people can look at probably what's happening on the Lower East Side as just an incredible model of so many solutions in one particular neighborhood. And hopefully that will be inspiring to other communities to, take a look at what's happening between waterfront access, what's happening in terms of climate resiliency within, whether it's parks and gardens and other permeable sites that can help absorb floodwaters, and how they can implement also green infrastructure and water harvesting, rainwater catchment, bioswales, pollinator gardens, composting programs. I mean, it's just an incredible array, and it's all happening around us. So I'm hoping that's exactly what we're doing. So I invite you, come on the Ecological City procession, and you'll see it all there.
It's just 65 million miles of space. Just overwhelming. I never forgot that.
And you can go to the gardensrising.org site. The feasibility study that we were talking about is there, and it has really great pictures and text about what we've been doing, what Felicia's been talking about. It's pretty informative, and we've even what's the word I'm looking for? We've even made the funders look at different ways, like solar is part of our project.
I just wonder if community's doing it.
Everybody's trying to do a little something, but it's funding. It's all about funding.
That's the
Gardensrising.org. Is that it? And one last question, or one or two last question, and then we'll.
I'm somewhat new to the world of resiliency. I also am on Community Board 1, and I can thank Catherine McVeigh, who was our board chair, for whatever knowledge I have, and a few other folks. Anyway, I have a question, which is, or maybe just a comment or a hope, is that for those of you who are involved so intimately and so directly and so brilliantly in the world of resiliency, that somehow the west side of Manhattan gets recognized. I find that each one of these conferences that I come to in panels, I often see one strip of Manhattan, and I understand this is Lower Manhattan, but the villages on the west side, that we learn a little bit more about the interface with the Hudson River Park Trust, with Chelsea, with in fact the lowest living area in when you look at these floodplain maps, which is Tribeca and the northern part. And though this may be not considered an area of need in sort of a fiscal way, it certainly is in terms of resiliency. And so I would hope that in these conversations to come, the processions and involvement and activities also engage the question as to what is going on the west side of Manhattan. Thank you.
The New York City Community Garden Coalition would like to replicate what we're doing in Gardens Rising. And whether that be on the west side of Manhattan or lower Manhattan or East Rockaway or up in Harlem, wherever it is, we believe that we can replicate what we're doing. And again, we go back to, it's an issue of funding more than anything else at this point, at least for us.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
So Felicia's program is fantastic. The puppets are wonderful. Everybody has a great time. And before I go on, I just want to say one thing. When she says waterfront access, she really means water access, not waterfront access, just to make it plain. Last year, 110,000 people got into the Hudson and Harlem River in human-powered boats, kayaks, outriggers, etc. So our rivers are being extensively used, and we want to get them cleaner for even better use. So my real question is, and I've been part of her program for a while, what happens at the close of the day? What happens on May 26th? How do we keep that thing going once all the puppets are put away into storage and everybody goes home? How do we keep that kind of activity percolating through the interests and through the memory of the various neighborhoods?
Well, I think as we did with the procession to save the gardens, the idea is hopefully we will be able to continue this project. And because we've engaged so many of the different community partners that are, whether it's LES Ready and Goals working on the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project and the different schools and the community centers, the idea is that we're pushing forward all of those initiatives. So I always have it in my head, just like I had it with the gardens. I wasn't just doing a cultural event. I was trying to get those gardens saved. And so in my mind here, I'm also wanting to push forward all the policy within the city on these sustainability initiatives and recognizing and protecting and pushing forward what's happening on a grassroots level. So I'm not going into this without sort of seeing the end game of where we're trying to go with it. And so there's, to me, a very clear plan in terms of all, like a coalition that essentially has been built through this procession and this project of where we're going in terms of the overall plan. That involves the solar, it involves the Gardens Rising and all the green infrastructure, it involves the waterfront. It's the whole ecosystem of sustainability and how we can move that forward into policy and action, which we feel, I think, on the grassroots level hasn't been embraced enough. So.
We are all puppets.
I think we have,
Way more.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to wrap up with final comments from our panelists.
I wanted to know if anyone would address the issue of involvement in the schools, especially public school. I know you mentioned harbor school, but I think that's the root for future involvement.
Yeah, we're engaging many of the
So-
public schools.
What is are you working with the board there?
Working
yeah.
with several schools, yeah, in the neighborhood.
Individuals.
One second. So the question was about involvement of schools. Did you have a follow-up question? We're gonna wrap up here, so we can.
Taking the public, like up in. Not individuals, I meant with the Board of Ed broadly maybe, or coordinating with all this testing programs that are doing, but
do you wanna-
need some interrelation.
The survival of this work is in the hands of the youth. And you know, I was at a conference recently and somebody pointed to me and said, everyone is beginning to look like you. And that there's a lot of truth to that. So we want to make sure that youth gets very involved in this. And I know Felicia does this really well. The design people, they do this really, really well. It's in the part of the engagement process of getting youth involved.
So
we won't survive without the youth.
But is the Board of Ed involved?
wait 1 second. So we're gonna wrap it up. We're gonna give our panelists each an opportunity to do final comments. They can put out recommendations, how you can all each get involved in your own communities, or how you can reach their organizations and plug into their work that they're doing. And I think the panelists will probably be here a little bit after the panel. So if you want to come up and meet some of them, you're welcome to do so. So I want to start with Lynn and see if you have any closing.
Sure. Well, I'll kind of address a little bit of this kind of idea of the future generations and taking up this kind of this mantle, right, in terms of where we're going. One of the things that came out of the work that we did was tons of engagement from the academic community and how important they are in this fight, especially from engineers and designers coming out of the education system and exposing them early to the idea of climate resilience and this idea of multi-benefits for infrastructure and how can gardens and create rainwater absorption. And so I think one of the things that in terms of going forward that we think is really important is making sure that those get embedded into curriculum and the education system for engineers, designers, and to be working across sectors too with each other, having engineers work with sociologists and health professionals and what that looks like. And so one of our initiatives, Rebuild by Design University, is part of doing that. And I think because there were so many academics that were involved, so there's a lot of network that was created, and so that's something that we're trying to push for. So when I think about the future, I very much think about some of that work and moving that forward. In terms of, I think you guys have probably a lot of great suggestions of maybe how to get involved. I will say if you guys are interested in the projects and where they're going and the updates, we have a monthly newsletter that provides all that information and where you can find more information from the city and that sort of thing. It's kind of a place to go to keep updated on it. It's just us kind of putting that information out there. We gather it from the city. They tell us kind of what's some of the best places. It's just a place for you to keep up to date. So I would say if you're interested in that, you should sign up for our newsletter.
The Ecological City Procession for Climate Solutions is on Saturday, May 12th. It's 6 hours long, going to 20 sites from the community gardens throughout the neighborhood of the Lower East Side and then along the waterfront from 6th Street down to the amphitheater at Cherry Street, each highlighting different climate solutions through performance, music, dance, and poetry. So I encourage all of you who want to be part of it. You can call us, volunteer. I always call it an ecological urban pilgrimage. You can watch it, but to do it and experience it, almost like running a marathon, is an incredible experience. So we're accepting people who want to volunteer, hand out programs, help with the food, water rickshaw, help carry a puppet. We have a few costume roles if you want to actually become a garden or river spirit. So I have postcards at the back, and you can take it. It's got the full schedule on it. All the information is on our website at earthcelebrations.com.
Well, you've heard enough from me. I want to thank Ariel. I want to thank Anna, my two friends, Lynn and Felicia. I want to thank all of you. If you need any more information about community gardens, we're at nyccgc.org and gardensrising.org. And just go out and fight for your right to keep this planet alive. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you. Thank our panelists.